Today I have this talk, which I've given a couple of times. I've tweaked it a little bit. But normally I have about 50 minutes to actually deliver this talk. So what I did, guess what I did to actually tweak this talk was add more slides, right? Because that's what you do. I've just got to add this bit. So I've got about 1 minute per slide. So we're going to have a jam-packed talk today. And we'll leave a lot of the Q&A to the time after. We've got 20 minutes to have loads of discussions and talks after that. So I have to start with this definition. And basically what it's saying is that this is a definition by Ken Kainer. And this was written quite a long time ago, and it's really stood the test of time. It says that software testing is an investigation, and I love that word, investigation, conducted to provide stakeholders information about the state of quality, about the quality of the software product or system under test. And I think it's really useful because we're at a software testing conference to remind ourselves that this is what software testing is all about. Because it can be really hard, isn't it, to actually say, well, what is software testing? And you're like, oh, well, I can tell you what the result of software testing is. But actually to explain what software testing is can be quite challenging. In 2001, around that time, there was a book written by a few of the testers, Bach, Pettiford, and Kainer. That's it, thank you. I thought it was Kainer, don't say Kainer. So Kainer, and they wrote this book, Lessons Learned in Software Testing, and one of the lessons that came out of that was that software testing is the headlights of the project. And the meaning behind this is that if you can imagine you're driving down a dark, dark road and you cannot see where you're going, you need to have headlights to help shine light and provide you information of what's ahead of you. Are there rocks on the road? Or is there another car coming? These sorts of things. So the analogy, which I thought was really clever, is that software testing is the same. It provides information to the rest of the team about the state of quality. And so for a long time, I've really used that analogy until one point it kind of hit me. And I thought, well, hang on a second. Do we always need headlights? I mean, if we are in the middle of the day and it's a straight road, are headlights required at that point? Or what happens if our car has a puncture? We're not going anywhere. Okay? So there's got to be, I guess, some sort of context in this. And in fact, when you think about the car analogy and the headlights analogy, there are lots and lots of different things in the car that provide information for us, aren't there? There's the petrol gauge. It tells us how much petrol we have to go, and we need that because if we run out of petrol, headlights are useless too. We've got our wonderful GPSs that tell us where we are and how far we have to go in our destination and which direction to take. And so there's lots and lots of gauges and bits of information that provide us information. There's lots of different ways of providing information and different types of information that we need in a car in order to get to our destination. So I like this thought, I like this thinking, and I like the way it challenges this thing that only software testing can provide us information. There's lots and lots of different things. And so I pulled this out a bit, and I said, okay, well, what does that mean to that analogy? Does that mean that analogy is broken now? No, but I think we can expand it. So software does, yes, it gives us visibility on the state of quality. Software testing itself does absolutely nothing to improve the state of quality. I mean, it makes sense. If you think about it, you find a bug. If that bug doesn't get fixed, the state of quality has not changed for your product one iota. So it's only when someone acts on that information that you've provided that the state of quality changes. So this is important because often we conflate software testing and quality. And when we talk about quality being a team responsibility, it's often inside people's head that gets switched to testing. So it means, yeah, everybody does testing in the team, when actually that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So I think it's useful to let's start pulling apart some of these things that we talk about. For example, when we talk about quality, what exactly do we mean by that? So I'm going to use Jerry Weinberg's definition of quality, which is quality is value to some person. And Michael Bolton added, who matters, right? Because the nature of quality is highly subjective. And I think this is really interesting when you're working as a team that says quality is a whole team responsibility. And if everybody is thinking about quality, but it's a different concept of what quality means, and you see this all the time. I mean, it makes sense. If you talk to developers about what does quality mean to them, that has a different understanding of quality. It might be in terms of clean code, right? Whereas if you think about an ops person and they talk about quality, it might be having the 5 nines. So understanding who we're talking to and what quality means is really, really important. But the trouble with this definition is that the very nature of it is kind of waffly and wavy. And that drives a lot of people crazy, right? It's like, well, that's great, it's subjective and it's hard to know, but how can we actually know if we're improving our quality if it's this soft, cushiony thing? So let's try and deconstruct it a little bit. Typically, we use quality attributes to break down quality into different aspects, right? So we have performance testing, we have security. We look at all these different quality attributes to help us break down quality. Today, I want to break it down in a slightly different way. And apologies if you can't see this because of the lighting in here. But really what I want to do is I want to break quality down into a lot of different areas. Because the systems that we have today and the way the concept of a product has really changed over time. A lot of us are working in a microservices architecture. And if we're working in this microservices architecture, that concept of a product isn't as useful as it was, right? So we might be working on an API, or we might be working on one tiny aspect of a product. And so having that whole idea of one product doesn't make sense at this point. So if we're looking at things if we're looking at our new product as a service, how does that affect? What should we be looking out for, right? Because it's hard to test if we're not thinking about things in terms of product. And I've been thinking about this a bit, and the concept of actually having emergent quality has come to me. And by that I mean that if we look after all the other aspects of what we're doing, if we look after our infrastructure, if we look after our code, if we look after our product in the terms of knowing that we're developing the right product, if we look at all these different things, good quality will emerge. And a great example of this is if you think about a team collaboration. From my experience, team collaboration is one of the #1 things that has an impact on quality, right? And it actually really has, to some degree, it doesn't have anything to do with the product itself. But if you have a team that works harmoniously together, if you have a tester who feels comfortable about raising bugs in a team, then you know that that information is going to be listened to. Having a tester on a team who is too scared to raise bugs in case they upset the team really is going to have a huge impact on product quality. So we can see how little things inside our context we can work on and we can try and understand better and improve, and that will in itself help product quality. One of the things I've been working on is having this, what I call a quality operating model. And I developed this quality workshop where we bring everyone in to the workshop, all the stakeholders, and we talk about exactly this. Well, what is quality for you? Is it your code? Is it your infrastructure? What matters to you? What pain points are stopping you getting a good quality in your context? And we start breaking that down into tasks. And we create tasks, and then at the end of the workshop, we ask the question, what's the smallest thing that we can do in order to move this thing forward? So we really make this whole subject of quality something tangible and something that everybody can act upon. So if you want to have a look at that quality workshop, I've actually got that on my blog in mavericktester.com. If you want to just do a search on quality workshop, that will come up. The other way we can break down quality is, I did refer to the quality attributes, but I think quality changes over time, doesn't it? I mean, we see that with, say, the mobile phones that we had in 1990 compared to the mobile phones we have today. If you handed somebody a mobile phone that actually didn't have an app in it, people would be like, what? So our understanding that quality does change over time. And because of that, we need to start looking at the quality attributes that we typically look at and say, are these still valid? Are these the things that our business and our stakeholders still value? Here's a thought. Speed to market as a quality attribute. If you talk to any business today, it's all about the fast eating the slow, not the large eating the small, right? It's all about that ability to respond to market demand rapidly. So if that is so important to our business, who are we as testers to become a blocker to that? Rather than being a blocker, how about we start looking at ways we can help assist that? How can we remove friction within the pipelines? How can we remove friction in the delivery process? What can we do there? And historically, we've done this really, really well. If you think about exploratory testing, for example, exploratory testing came out of a world that was really heavily documented process with a lot of bloat in it. And yet, in exploratory testing, we started asking the question, where is the value? We started questioning the value of really heavy documentation, and we started looking at the value that the tester actually does through skilled activity. So we're good at this sort of stuff. We're good at asking those sorts of questions, and we need to continue asking those sorts of questions today. Another aspect is recoverability. And I think it's great Charity Majors spoke today about the whole concept of observability. Elizabeth Hendrick speaks about recoverability, and she's got a great blog post that talks about recoverability over perfection. And it's that idea that rather than us trying to make perfect software, how about saying, you know what, in some contexts, it's okay for that to happen. Maybe what we should be looking at is our ability to recover quickly. Are we testing for that? That would be interesting. And maybe that's something that our ops team or people would be really interested in supporting us in those experimentations. Observability, we had a whole keynote on that today. And the concept of exploratory testing in production. When I was working in a fintech, and this is in banking, I had a banking license, this was where we were moving to. Like, there is no way that we can stop thinking about how can we test for these sorts of things in production. We've got to move into this space, and we've got to take our companies with us into that space. So as I was going through this thinking, I came up with a new word, because it came to me that actually what we need to be doing is understanding the state of quality at any point in time. The big gotcha for us is that our testing, and as we all know this, that our testing right at the end before a release gives us big surprises, and nobody likes big surprises right before a release, okay? If we have a surprise early on, that's not great, but you know what? We've got the time to do something about it. A big surprise right before a release, bad news. So how can we where we focus on quality. We talk about quality all the day. This is our role. How can we start thinking about how can we identify quality early on? You know, talking to our devs about how do we know we have good code? How do we know we have clean code? You know, there's tools out there. There's so many tools that can support us in this that help identify duplication and lots of different things that we can look at. So we want to start having these conversations about how do we know we have good quality. I like this thought exercise. What happens if we couldn't do software testing? How would we know we had a good quality product? Right? That'd be an interesting thought exercise to go through with your organization. There's a huge amount of dependency on software testing at the moment. And if you think about the cost and the maintenance we have in test automation, we've got to start thinking about how that is adding so much bloat to our systems, to our ability to deploy rapidly. I like to also think sometimes it's hard to think about quality. As I said, it's that hard to identify. In some ways, it's easier to identify threats to quality, right? We can say, no, we're not sure what we want, but we know we don't want that, okay? So sometimes it's useful to twist it round and say, okay, well, what are the threats to quality? If we're struggling to understand what we want, maybe we can talk about what we don't want. So today, we know that security is becoming a really, really key aspect. I was at a CIO summit where security, they talked about, at the CIO summit, they talked about security for about at least half of the panel discussion. There was discussion on security. They'd done a survey where all the CIOs basically felt that they were doing security really, really well and that they didn't think they need to improve. That concerned me. Because when you look at the practices, within our organizations, they don't always reflect that. So I'm not sure it's whether people just, the CIs don't just want to admit that they have poor security practices, but certainly that this is an area of concern for us all. Poor performance, usability, these are things that we're familiar with. But looking at things like story splitting, one of the things I see is that if we don't split our stories correctly, we end up with huge dependencies within the stories. And this can be a real challenge when we get to testing, right? Because it's very hard for us to test one story without waiting for the other stories to be built. And then we get to a situation where we have blockage in the system because we're waiting for these dependencies. So thinking about, well, when we're in the planning session, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how we can remove dependencies, and maybe we can split our stories in slightly different ways. How can we improve our feedback loops? How can we improve our monitoring? Do we have discussions in planning sessions about monitoring? How are we going to test for monitoring? How are we going to be able to detect this in production if something goes wrong? Again, these are really interesting conversations to be having with our teams. So what does this mean in this new world? Does that mean that testers have no place? Certainly it can feel like that sometimes, right? But I really believe that the skills that we have as testers provide enormous value within our organizations. The types of questioning they ask, our ability to identify risk. We identify risk. We do this every day. All we think about is how things might go wrong. We are the experts in this space, right? But that's very, very useful for us to be able to bring that skill set into different areas. So how can we use the skills that we have, but maybe in a slightly different context that we're used to? So rather than thinking ourselves as only testing software, maybe think about ourselves as risk investigators. And where is the risk in the system? How can I identify that? How can I put in some small experiments that help us start understanding and collecting data to see if there is a real problem here or not? There's also the look at the concept of quality coaches, and something that I've been working on quite a bit. And that's the ability of using our skill sets to help other people become better in the testing space, but also to challenge their thinking about these sorts of things. To think about, in the planning sessions, well, what are the sorts of questions we can be asking up here? Are we falling into the trap of thinking about stories in only a functional term rather than as a whole system? And what can we do about that? And how can we improve that? We can also help in not falling into the trap, especially when we're looking in microservices and we're moving to this smaller and smaller bits and smaller releases. It's so easy for us to forget that our consumers really don't give a damn about microservices. They don't care if you've got mocks or dependencies in there. All they want to do is get their job done. So how can we help our organizations to remember that and to provide that context? And I think that this idea of testing in production, to me, is somewhere where we can do this really, really usefully. So exploring about how can we start identifying, are we on the right track? Do we understand our consumers well? Are we thinking about the system as a whole? Do we understand the context in which we're developing? It scares me sometimes the number of times when we're working in agile teams where people seem to feel that the context doesn't really matter. So helping people understand that context and bringing that information into the teams is going to become more and more relevant to us. I spoke also about removing waste. I want to explore that in a little bit more detail. So consider things like build times. Are your build times taking an extraordinary length of time? What about your test automation? Is it taking a long time for these to run? Can you identify if there's duplication in your test automation? Often you'll find that because you've got a flaky test, you might have that test run 2 or 3 times, right? That happens. So if you think about that, it's like, well, yeah, that might be an effective solution for someone to, in running terms, but that can actually end up having a huge cost if everyone is taking that approach. So thinking of the concept that every test has a cost. It takes time to think up, it takes time to design, it takes time to execute, and we all know it takes time to maintain, and then evaluate the information from that. So we want to be making sure that the tests that we're designing are really valuable to our organizations, or else that they're really cheap to run. We've got to be thinking about these things. Pointless meetings. I'm just going to skip over that one. We've all been there. Lack of visibility. This is an interesting one. And I'm not sure if it's about waste in a sense, but I think sometimes that we need to have these discussions about helping people understand the state of quality. Now, this is a really tough one to do. For me, it's about if you don't provide the information, what's going to happen is inevitably is your stakeholders are going to substitute what they think the state of quality is, and they're going to use it in their language. So the finance person is going to estimate the value in terms of cost. So thinking about that you want to make sure that you are connecting what you're doing with people outside of the engineering department. How can you generate those conversations with your business, with your other departments to help them understand the state of quality? Because this is going to get really hard for them. And when things get hard, people will react, and not necessarily in a very positive way. And so you want to be bridging that gap and start having these conversations about how you can help them understand the state of quality in their language and in their terms. Again, we talked about recovery from failure, removing rework. So if you look at things in terms of every time a story has to go back left, you could consider that rework. So every time it needs to have a clarification or a bug is found and it needs to be fixed, that is rework. So you could consider looking at, how can we reduce the amount of rework in a story? And delays and duplication, so forth. I kind of touched lightly on making quality visible. And I'm going to bring up, often this will be, people will end up talking about metrics in these terms, right? So how can we talk about quality in a way that we can help make it visible and we can use it that is providing useful information? The things that I've been working on is making quality visible from the start. So looking at quality in all those different ways. Remember we talked about quality of code. How can we make that visible? How can people have an understanding that we are confident about the quality of the code that's been written? And that is one aspect of understanding how good the quality is. Tracking quality improvements over time. So if you're in a situation where you're making improvements related to quality, how can people see that they are actually making tangible improvements to what they're doing and giving them a sense that they're actually achieving something good here? So we want to be able to make improvements and changes. We want to make people feel good about that. So how can we help them understand that this is getting better or moving to a better place? I like the idea of, rather than trying to do huge changes, is to look at lots and lots of small different experiments and making small changes rather than going for that one huge project that does this massive quality improvement. So on a daily basis, what can be incorporated within teams that will help gradually improve quality over time? And thinking of it as a long-term thing, rather than we're going to put this massive effort into improving quality. Another thing that I've been doing, and one way we can do that, is actually by looking at coaching. I think coaching is a really powerful way, and you can do this through pairing as well, but it's actually helping people work through things in a small time through coaching and helping them improve skills. So, making quality visible. One of the things that you could look at is how can we actually improve quality by focusing on the outcome that the business want. Coming up with quality in terms of those outcomes. Developing small tasks that will slowly build to improving quality on a day-by-day basis. Here's a smaller little one to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So say that you wanted to move to a situation where you're deploying on a weekly basis. Maybe you're doing fortnightly deploys, and the goal is to move to weekly ones. How can we actually start conducting it? How can we actually start doing that? Well, one of the things that we might be looking at is reducing end-to-end testing by, say, 20%. That's the time to execute the testing, right? So we would say, okay, well, let's not try and reduce it massively. Let's take a small amount and see if we can reduce that. And maybe we can do that through parallelization, or maybe we can actually start cutting down the amount of tests that are being run. There's lots of ways we could actually do this, but that's our goal. We want to reduce the end-to-end testing by 20%. So we can do that in a number of ways. And looking at improving early testing earlier, and things like that. And finally, the tasks that we could do, might consider, well, rather than having lots of end-to-end testing, maybe we could introduce unit testing at an early stage, or some things like packed or API testing, where we can start looking at trying to have tests that are earlier on, that are isolated and not necessarily dependent on each other, so we can do some earlier testing. So it's just ways of actually looking to how can we start talking about this? How can we break down and start having conversations about this and helping people understand how we're moving to these quality-related goals? In the bad old days, we had something called quality engineering. Quality engineering was typically driven by a project management office. And that PMO would stand there in their big ivory tower, and they would produce forth this wonderful process that everyone had to adhere to. And typically, when you saw this, it was often integrated with things like ISO 9001. And so you had a very top-down approach to quality engineering where companies imposed this onto teams. And often these were a situation where the actual process, everybody had to do things the same way. And the metrics that were being used were determined by this external office. That just doesn't work. And we've all been, and maybe not all of you, but some of you have definitely had scarred experiences from that. I would like to suggest a kind of flipped approach. I think we need to look at the team and have a bottom-up approach to these sorts of things. Rather than thinking of going top-down and imposing, talking to the teams and asking, well, what is quality for you? And how are you going to measure that? And what does that work in your context? Because we know that many teams are working on different types of technologies. You might have one team who's working on a monolith, whereas another team is working in microservices. It just doesn't make sense to have consistency across these teams. Teams got to have the autonomy and the ability to be able to make choices about how they're going to understand quality and start measuring quality. That word understand is important. We don't want to fall into the trap of using our metrics to actually measure people or validate things. We're having metrics in order to be able to understand and improve rather than trying to actually put teams against each other and compare each other in that way. It's one of the things I do when I'm talking about metrics is I often talk about how can this metric be gamified, right? So what value is it bringing and why are we doing it? But also how can this actual metric be gamified? So when we take on a metric, we're actually going in with making an informed decision about what we're doing and we understand the risks around measuring this thing. Because we can't just stop saying we're not going to use metrics. It's just not useful to our businesses. We've got to start finding ways that are useful for them in order to be able to help them understand quality. We need to align them to business outcomes rather than actually having them some weird thing like, well, we have all our tests are green. It's like, okay. What does that mean for me in marketing? So understanding what the business are going to and trying to talk about quality in those terms. And again, I have this huge thing about making stuff dispensable. It's like, chuck it out if it's not working. Don't get stuck on a metric. Don't get stuck on measuring something because that's what we've always done. And that's what we're doing. And here's our dashboard, and we're measuring velocity because that's what we do, and no one looks at it. So really, you've got to think critically through these things and start thinking about what do we really need, and if it's not working, let's just drop it and try something else. I talked a lot about business outcomes, and I want to go into that. I like this quote from John Cutler because it challenges me to think about what is really important here. So often when we're writing stories and we're developing stories and we're testing for stories, it's all about that done, right? And once we hit the done, we've tested it, it's like gone. All right, next thing, we're into something else. But what actually is done? What happens if we started thinking about done in terms of delivering business value and business outcomes? If we were doing that, what would we be testing for? What would we be trying to understand? And what sort of conversations would we be having within our organizations that would be happening on a day-to-day basis because of that? And I like this thought exercise. It's challenging us to think about testing and quality in a very, very different way. So to bring the whole thing together, this is how I like to summarize. Yes, software testing is the headlights. We need software testing, absolutely. But quality is the journey. And it's a constant journey. It's going on for a long time. And the thing that helps us focus where to go and what to do are our business outcomes. So software testing is the headlights, quality is the journey, and business outcomes are the destination. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. So we have the cards. If you have a question for Anne-Marie, hold up a green card. And what's the questions? So I can see it. Thank you. Eyes are getting old. And when you ask your question, you need to stand close to the microphone because we're recording this.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for this great talk. At some point in your talk, you were speaking how people in teams have to become risk analyzers.
Risk investigators, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
From my experience, I firmly believe in that as well. And from my experience, it's hard to get people to think adequately about risk and coming up with risks in a good way. Do you have any sort of mechanisms or insights on how risk investigation should be achieved when you're coaching teams?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways you can do it, depending on who you're talking to, right? Some of the things that I do in planning sessions is talking about how are we going to be able to detect stuff in production, for example. For me, that's immediately you're broadening that conversation, and people were suddenly realizing that that's where we need to be heading. We need to be focusing on things outside of simply the product itself, like not the product itself, but coding and developing. I have worked in organizations where we've had testers and teams, and they have really got to the point where they've worked with teams where they're finding they've got less and less testing to do because the team's actually humming along. They're doing a lot of the testing themselves. And we basically invented this concept of swarming. And when testers had time that they weren't working in their teams, they would actually get together and start investigating stuff in different places. So that was not necessarily within their remit. So I guess not asking for permission. In some cases, it's just going off and doing something. And it could be that you're just conducting a small experiment to collect data. We did that in a performance. We had this kind of smell that things weren't right about performance, and we didn't have any real data. It was just a hunch. And so we actually conducted this really rough, nasty experiment that helped us just get some basic data to see if there was a real problem. Turned out there was a massive problem, and they had to redesign the architecture in order to deal with that. But that little experiment in that space provided a huge amount of value because the engineers then took over the problem, but they could see they had data. We had data to say, look, rather than we think you should be working on performance. So collecting data is a really useful and powerful tool. I'm sure when you're speaking to engineers and people like that, because they can really hook into that and they can use that. Another thing that we did was going down and actually not having, sometimes, in your sprints or whatever, in your iterations, you'll have your demos at some point. Well, we flipped that over, and we basically went and asked the business to have their demos. So we would go down to the business and they would do a demo of how they operated their systems on a day-to-day basis. So just sitting and observing how people use the systems can be very powerful information to bring back into the teams. Because you start seeing things like repetition, right? So you have that one button that you use. Yeah, we test it once. Yeah, of course it works. But the business, they have to use it 100 times during the day. Very different. So thinking those sorts of things, just trying to think about how you could do that.
Thank you.
Hi, you mentioned talking about recognizing poorly split stories and dependency because that's, a threat to quality. Our group is just getting started with being involved in discussing the stories as they get put into development. So we don't have a lot. We have experience with trying to influence the acceptance criteria to make sure it's testable, but we don't have a ton of experience with influencing the story itself and talking about how the stories can be split off. Can you tell me a little bit more about how we can talk about splitting stories? I know I've heard about the user story mapping book by Patton, but what else do you have to offer about talking about that?
Okay, so I think it's not necessarily, I guess it depends, one of the things you're going to have to look at is how much collaboration you have with people who are doing the story splitting. So it could be that rather than trying to sort of have that big step of doing that dependencies is maybe the first step is how's the collaboration going between the product or whoever's, I don't know, in your team, whoever does the story splitting and makes those decisions, but how can I start building up conversations about, how can we improve stuff, and are they open to even having those conversations? Because I think if you don't have that foundation, like coming in and saying, I'm going to show you how to split your stories, it's not going to go down very well, okay? So, it's about having that pragmatic approach to a lot of this. I'm setting out a lot of big ideas out here, but I always try and find people you can initially collaborate rather than trying to make a massive change. It's about those small little changes. But having the conversation about how are we going to test this, right? So, and couching it in terms of ways that will help improve their life rather than helping improve your life. I think one of the challenges about testability is that you're talking about testing. And whereas they kind of care about testing, it's not that, funnily enough, it's not the one thing that they think about every single moment of the day. They've got lots of other things that they're thinking and they care about. So what do they care about, and how can you meet their needs, and then how can you hook in what you need into that conversation is how I would be thinking about things.
Okay. By the way, the yellow cards are following on. If you have something additional to contribute, then that's what the card is for.
Yeah, I'd love to hear, if anyone's got an experience of how they've done that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, so keep that in mind. The green cards also, if you have an experience that is similar to or very different from ones you've heard, that's what it's for.
I'm sorry, I think I got the wrong card, but so here goes my question. Thank you for the presentation. It was very, very good. So you spoke about not being scared about bringing up bugs, but you also spoke about speed to market is key. We know that our stakeholders, they do not care if we have a very well-tested app, if it is not out there making money for them or whatever the purpose it is. But once we know we have automation, as we can leverage automation in those cases, but once we made our team buy into this idea that automation is the way to go. It is very helpful for this end product. How do we bring up the conversation for the higher ups? I mean, it is a tough conversation, bringing it up to your team and making them believe. But then, obviously, there are deadlines and all of that in the agile world.
Okay, I'm not fully sure I 100% understand the question. So you've got test automation in there already. So you've already increased the speed, but you need to have a conversation about what?
Actually, we know that we can use test automation.
All right,
Our team
okay.
has bought into it, but we usually don't have time since there are deadlines that we need to meet.
Oh, okay.
So we
Yep,
can
yep,
have
yep.
half-baked automation or no automation at all.
Yeah, look, that's a great question. So absolutely, having this buy-in from the top is hugely beneficial. I would say nearly essential to that success. Because if you don't have the time to make those, that time is not allocated in a formal way, you are constantly going to struggle to really make those realistic achievements. Having said that, there might be, I don't fully know you understand how under the pump you are, but think about what is the minimum amount we can do to provide evidence to someone senior that will demonstrate the value, right? So rather than trying to do a full automation suite or trying to do like a whole amount, it's like pick something that you know they value and pick something and just make them really cheap. Don't spend a lot of effort into making beautiful tests or anything like that. It's about being able to demonstrate some value to someone who doesn't necessarily understand it from that context. So, and thinking about, well, and I say pick something that they value, that's how you kind of pull it in a way. So, yeah, sure, you might be able to automate something over here, but if they don't care about it, you're not necessarily going to demonstrate that real value. So think about that. Think about who is the person to influence, right? You probably know. And talking about also, I'd be going and saying, well, what are the objections you have to doing this? You know, why can't we have this time? Has anyone gone and asked for the time, right? Maybe you're just making an assumption that this person won't give you that time. And maybe they're like, wow, that's great. I can make a bit of time for you. I'll go and speak to whoever on your behalf and make that time for you. So yeah, little experiments to try and demonstrate value, making sure you're thinking of the right person, and yeah, just challenge the fact that, you know, what have we done to date, and going off to them, and if you have done stuff today, ask them about I have this thing called collecting objections. Rather than try and find out the reasons why. What are the lists of things why it can't be done? And don't try and defend it. Don't try and kind of have reasons why, don't try and sort of provide answers to that. Just collect them and then go away and think about them. Maybe share them with your team and go, well, what can we do about this? How can we help overcome these objections? And then think about how you can sort of start breaking down those objections in a measured way.
And kind of riffing off of this incrementally, as you were saying, you don't have to have the solution right away. You're prototyping, and be flexible. Listen to what your sponsor says, or the person that you're trying to address says, and you can make it better. And if it isn't right, you haven't invested a lot. So it becomes a big win just for listening to them, just for trying to address their questions, their concerns. Any more green cards or yellow cards? Any more questions? Okay, you did a
Cool.
super job.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much. I'm here till Friday, so feel free to come up and ask me any questions anytime. Always happy to have a chat. Thank you very much.